with our fourth section on technology.
Technology. Remember what Bogna said in yesterday's first session. She said we need non-human tools to learn about non-human systems, such as artificial intelligence.
And there was some debate about what we can gain and lose if we think of artificial intelligence as a kind of non-human system, or what that might even mean.
Today's first conversation between Teresa Retzer and Albert-László Barabási will explore the radical impossibilities of artificial intelligence, asking what role it can play in building or imagining sustainable and collective futures.
The conversation will be immediately followed by our first panel discussion with Maximilian Ilse, Simone Niquille, moderated by Ariana Dongus. A quick reminder, I will join the Q&A of the panel discussion to pass on questions from our Telegram group to the panelists. So check out the Telegram group if you want to join the discussion, give us your questions there. And yeah, I'll be there waiting for them.
And Moritz, are you ready for our first conversation?
Hello everyone, welcome to the Driving the Human Festival. I will have an interview with Albert-László Barabási today, who is actually the founder of the Barabási Lab. He will have an exhibition together with his lab at the ZKM that will open in March 2021. I'm very happy to have you here. Welcome, László.
Teresa, it's a pleasure talking with you, and it's a real pleasure to be able to engage with ZKM and your colleagues there.
Thank you so much. So you are holding a professorship of network science at the Northeastern University and also an appointment in the Department of Medicine in the Harvard Medical School in Boston, where you also founded the Barabási Lab. So how are your various occupations, the one as a university professor and the director of a research lab, interconnected?
Well, Teresa, they're all the same, let's put it this way, right? Because what really my lab does is try to understand complexity through networks. And there are multiple applications to this problem, to this kind of general pursuit. Some of the applications come in social systems, other in computer systems, and yet others come in the area of health and medical science. So one of the reasons I have so many different appointments is because the results of our pursuits are rather universal and apply to many, many different disciplines. And we embrace these applications.
In this festival, we try to emphasize the complexities of our time. In how far can network science help us to identify these complexities, and how can the methodology of networks help to deal with them?
Well, I personally believe that there is no way we can understand complexity without networks. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about the systems that we perceive as complex. Say the brain, which is really complex because there's a giant number of connected components, neurons that form the brain, or the cell, or the living system, that's really just a giant number of molecules and genes, a different kind of molecules that are connected by chemical interactions and binding interactions and so on. And even if we get to kind of higher levels of organization, like societies or economies, really the complexity is coming not as much from the components, but the interactions between them. That is the underlying networks they form. And I would actually argue that there is no complex system without a network, which also implies that we will never be able to understand complex systems unless we are aware of the networks behind them. We pursue them as a network system, and we developed a set of tools to really map these complex systems out and understand how the interactions between different components lead to that complexity that we kind of perceive around us.
So your networks are based on data sets. How do you get the access to this data, and how is it collected?
Well, this is a very important question indeed, because the reason network science has really emerged kind of in the 21st century, early years of 21st century, is because for the first time, the data became available at large enough scale to really be able to understand these complex systems. And, you know, partly because of the internet, partly because the storage ability, partly because the way the scientists and the sociologists and different practitioners have organized data, suddenly we have a way of collecting that and studying that. But data is never perfect. And hence, my lab's pursuit is really very deeply rooted in finding the right data for the particular problem. And I could even go as far as to say the data drives of what we can study. And this is nothing unusual, right? Scientific advances are often driven by the tools, by the measurement tools, by the methodologies, by the techniques that we developed, right? And they really drive what is it, what are the type of questions we can ask, and how do we address them? In the same way, in network science, data is the primary step, right? What is the type of data sets you can acquire, how accurate they are, and what type of insights we would get from them. One thing I always warn my students is that by the time the data becomes perfect and accurate, all the discoveries will have been made. Meaning that we need to be prepared to work from incomplete and noisy data. And that's precisely the challenge for us. How do you extract conclusions that are valid even when the data becomes complete from the early stage, when the data is just about to emerge and it has the well-known limitations?
This brings me also to another question we addressed to one of our panelists, Maximilian Ilse. Actually, he said it's a big problem that always the same data sets are used for all kinds of research. And you are saying there will be maybe a future in which all data is out there and we can make network science out of it and show it to other people how actually everything is interconnected. But this step seems very far away to me.
Yes, and often we don't even need all the data, right? Because it always depends on the nature of the questions we want to ask, how good and how accurate the data needs to be. I would probably argue that we will never arrive to the point when all the data is available, because this is a little bit like the idea that there will be a moment where we will have discovered everything in science and there is nothing to be discovered. And what science practice shows is the opposite. The more we discover, the more questions we have. So the more data we will have, the more sophisticated questions will emerge. And maybe we don't need new data, but then we need new ways of conceptualize the data, new ways to kind of think about the system. And once you do that, then you realize you need more data.
Thank you. So one of your research interests focuses in measuring success in science. What does success in science actually mean, and to what extent is the scale of success compatible with the benefit to the general public?
Success is a very complicated word, not only in science, but also in art and in any realm of life. And it's complicated because there are inner measures of success, right? That are very important, like even just me making in time for this interview and doing a good job with you could be something that gives me a satisfaction. And I don't need an external measure of success to really kind of measure that. On the other hand, science is a very collective phenomenon, and most intellectual pursuits are. And some ideas, some discoveries survive and are embraced by the community, and others are forgotten. And there are certain measures of success in the sense of whose view, whose theory, whose approach is the prevailing one in the future or momentarily. And hence, we in the last kind of 10 years have embraced in the lab the pursuit of trying to quantify these external measures of success, meaning the collective measures of success that is not really kind of achieved by you as a scientist or by you or by a particular paper, but rather by the community's perception of what really that means. One way to think about it, and the way I always think about it, is that there is a performance and a success piece in science or any other pursuit. Performance is what you do. Science, however, or let me rephrase it, performance is what you do. Success, however, is what the community sees of that performance, how well it acknowledges it, and whether it rewards you with it. And rewards can be many, many different things. Can be citations, can be money, can be prices, can be positions, and so on. But at the end, these external measures of success really determine what will the next generation have access to. And they really determine how the canon of knowledge emerges within the society and within science. And that's the reason why we thought, let's take advantage of the exceptional amount of data that really has emerged about the scientific pursuit and try to understand the mechanisms and the processes that drive success in science.
So you already critically engaged actually with this measurement of success in science, because what you said is it's not very much compatible with the benefit to the general public, probably, because the measurements are just different. It's not like what is really needed for people and these kinds of things. Well,
it's a wonderful question that you ask, right? Is that what is the primary goal of science, right? And of course, at the end, the fundamental goal of science is to better actually human life, right? Whether it's from biology to sociology, but there is also an element of curiosity in science, which is really to try to understand what are the mechanisms that drive certain processes. And often in scientists' mind, the two of them can be disconnected. They don't have to be, but can be disconnected. And often fabulous discoveries are made without a particular applied goal in mind. So therefore, I would say that many scientific discoveries, many major discoveries are often driven by individual curiosity and an intellectual pursuit, and then later turn out to have very practical applications that really change our daily life. And the two have really worked hand in hand. In other cases, however, major discoveries are driven by a need, by a societal need that scientists recognize and work towards them. I think science would be crippled if we would actually eliminate any aspects of it. That if we would eliminate curiosity or if we eliminate need. Together, really, that really drive many scientists and the enterprise to move forward. As well, together, they drive the society's acceptance and investment into science.
Thanks. So let's talk about your upcoming exhibition that will open in March 2021. So it also deals with urgent matters. So some of the main topics are based on research on COVID-19. What is your approach in your research on the virus, and what did you find out about COVID-19?
So first of all, I'm really delighted that ZKM is really going to show, starting from March, my lab's work. And really, this is an opportunity to show what happened in the last 25 years in network visualization in my lab. And I want to emphasize that we often did that because, visualization offers another language for us to understand the science that we do and nature and society, as well as another language to communicate our findings. And yes, part of our pursuit, my lab's pursuit, includes thinking about COVID. And they come in different directions depending on how you approach it. For example, right after the COVID, the lockdown has started, my lab activated the knowledge base we have about drugs and our ability to predict what drugs could work and what doesn't, to search for potential drugs for COVID. To be more precise, to really identify among the 6,000 drugs that are already on the market and available for patients, the few that may be beneficial for COVID patients. And we did so by embracing the tools of network medicines that were really developed over the last 15 years in my lab to identify where does in the cell the virus attack the network, and what are the molecules what are the drugs that can block the virus's ability to do so. On the other hand, thinking about COVID has much deeper roots in network science. About 20 years ago, Alessandro Vespignani and Romualdo Pastor-Satoras have actually published a landmark paper who have shown that in real-looking networks, so-called scale-free networks, viruses spread in a very different way. And that has really given birth to what we call today network epidemiology. And the institute that I'm part of in Boston, the Network Science Institute, is currently, and has been for the last few months, the White House's Prediction Institute, that they are providing them insights about where the virus will spread and how to actually, what kind of interventions could slow down the virus. My lab has also been involved in the last 20 years of trying to develop models for spreading. And indeed, about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity for the first time to use mobile phone data to ask how would the virus actually spread if it spreads by contact between individuals, because the mobile phone data allowed us to identify where people are and when they come into contact. I'm delighted that both of the works, both the how do we find the right drug for COVID, as well as how do we think about spreading processes and the spread of virus like COVID, will actually be represented in the ZKM exhibit.
Thank you. Let's continue with the last question. So you are investing a lot of energy in opening up your research to the public by creating art exhibitions around the world. What motivates you?
Well, it's interesting. The way I think about it is that we have one single pursuit, and that's the pursuit of discovery. That is true, and try to understand complex systems. But we have three different languages in the way we talk about them, right? One language actually is the scientific language, which is we publish scientific papers full of formulas and algorithms and so on. And that is really directed towards the scientific community. The other language, which I often use, is to write general audience books, where we translate the scientific finding into a language that is accessible for a wider audience. And the third language is really that of making things visual, that is to be able to see complexity and to be able to see the roots of complexity. And the truth is that this third language has been largely invisible in the last 20-25 years, because we did not have a natural home for it. They didn't fit into the research papers nor into the general audience text. So the ZKM offered opportunity, as well as the Ludwig Museum offered opportunity that is ongoing right now, really offers the first chance to show these works.
You have given us insight in the work of a network scientist, and now we also know about your upcoming show at the ZKM Karlsruhe, which will open in March 2021. The Barabási lab has also right now a show going on at the Ludwig Museum in Budapest. And I wanted to say thank you very much for this very nice interview. So now back to the festival.
Yeah, good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of the Driving the Human Kickoff Conference. And I hope you are all well and comfortable behind your screens, wherever you are. I greet you from Grey Berlin. My name is Ariana Dongus, and I'm very delighted to moderate this panel on technology. I'm a media scholar, PhD researcher and journalist, and also work at the HFG Karlsruhe, the University of Arts and Design, in the theory department. And together with Professor Pasquinelli, I coordinate the research group, KIM, on critical studies in AI. It is also situated here at the HFG. And in our projects, we politicize AI, artificial intelligence, by addressing emerging new potentialities and complex reality. So we want to criticize techno-euphoria around AI, but also assess its potentialities, for instance, for digital activism. So we want to dismantle the notion of technology as neutral, hence for the good per se, by showing its limits, its fallacies, its biases, But also this allows us then in a second step to imagine and design alternative uses, because of course technology should benefit the whole of society and not just a particular class or certain groups. And I think these two aspects, first, a proper analysis, a criticism, and then the imagination of an alternative solidaric other future will be roughly mirrored in the structure of this panel today. And we will address pressing issues, we believe, related to the widespread deployment of AI systems, its implications for culture and societies. And we start our discussion in focusing on the limits and fallacies of AI systems, and something that we could maybe name image politics or politics of AI training data sets. If you participated already in this conference, you will know this already. If not, please let me quickly walk you through the structure of this panel. So we start the discussion with a quite short introduction by the panelists themselves, in which they address important points and arguments that we will refer to later in the discussion. And please feel free to comment and ask questions in the Q&A session after the panel. And if you have questions or want to leave a comment right now during the panel itself, we also have a Telegram chat open to your contribution that was communicated or is communicated with you widely, I guess. And dear Maximilian, dear Max, maybe this is a good starting point now to hear about your work expertise. Let me quickly introduce Max to you. He's a PhD candidate at the Amsterdam Machine Learning Lab, and he is developing novel AI algorithms primarily for computer vision applications, like, for instance, image classification and segmentation. He will explain what that means to you. Yeah, and I'm happy to welcome you, and please give us a short statement about your angle on the topic.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Ariana for this introduction. I maybe will go shortly over what I do on a daily basis. So, like, I'm a PhD student in my last year, and my PhD topic is really developing of AI algorithms. And what that usually means is I have to choose two things. I have to choose a number of parameters and how these parameters are connected in an AI model. And the second part is usually I have to choose a training algorithm that then will adjust these parameters in the model. And like a simple example is always like classifying dogs and cats, like images of dogs and cats. And so for each of these two classes, I have to give to the AI model a lot of training examples, which means an image of like a cat or a dog, and then a label that tells the algorithm, the AI model, there is a dog or a cat in the picture. And it is very important to stress here that I don't tell the AI model what to look for. Like, I don't tell, like, look for noses and ears to distinguish between cats and dogs. I just give it the data, and it needs to figure out all of that by itself, like the model by itself. And to do that reliably, it needs a lot of data. And one thing I kind of become concerned about now, especially in the late stage of my PhD, is these models will use everything they can find in these pictures. And that leads to a lot of problems. And since the data sets become bigger and bigger, it becomes harder to tell what is actually in these data sets and what is actually the AI model using to do its task. And in addition, maybe as a last note, is a lot of the time I also don't know really where each item in the data set comes from. And so I think these are rather concerning questions that are usually not asked in the field that I am in, where people really strive for novelty and performance.
Yeah, thanks so much, Max. I think we will get back to this right away, but for now it is my pleasure to introduce Simone Nikki. She's a designer and researcher based in Amsterdam, and she teaches design research at Art it's a University of the Arts in Arnhem, and is Chief Information Officer at the Design Academy Eindhoven. So at least I can pronounce the Dutch names correctly. Dear Simone, please also quickly introduce yourself and your work.
Yes, thank you, Ariana, for this introduction. And thanks for having me virtually here, even though we're in the same physical place, more or less, Max. So, I mean, I'll just sort of I think, hook onto the questions that Max ended with. I mean, I'm a designer researcher with a studio called Techno Flesh, and what that means is mainly that I'm concerned with questions around computer vision, so around representation. A lot of my work sort of begun with looking into how a body is digitized, and that sort of led to looking into the histories of 3D scanning, photogrammetry, sort of different modes of capturing that sort of surpass photography as a wet lab. And through that sort of research into, for example, facial recognition, something I was doing a while ago, it really sort of led me into asking, hey, but facial recognition, sure, it kind of makes sense to the human mind, what that means to recognize a face. But how is something like that translated to computer vision or machine vision, where you sort of outsource it to a different intelligence? I think on this panel, we sort of refer to it as an artificial intelligence. So how does vision, something that is pretty banal and taken for granted, even though it's not even for a human, how is that being translated to other than human? And with that, I think come questions that to me are super fascinating, and from what I heard from Max as well. And I think part of what is so fascinating about them is, again, that they're taken for granted often when it's something that you can just simply do. So for example, the cat and dog example is something, yeah, well, sure, I know what a cat and a dog is, but having to actually translate it and explain this either to another sort of species or to a machine comes with a lot of sort of design questions, I believe, that are really interesting and also have consequences on society at large. And this is where the data set comes in. And I think that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit more.
We will, but let me first go back to Max's research, because we really have a rare opportunity to have a programmer, researcher, scientist with us who's really working on the fundamentals of object detection. And our first meeting, you were saying a lot of the algorithms you develop are so-called multi-purpose algorithms. That means that you can have one algorithm, but the deployment, the possibilities are multiple, obviously. So I would be interested in how do you know what kind of algorithm, the algorithms that you develop, in what areas will they be deployed, for one? And then also you had this notion of questionable research that I really like, that I would like to get back to, because how can you make sure that you only detect a cat or a mouse or a dog or a face? How can you not, how to say, like you said something, there is a tendency, or correct me if I'm wrong, to detect anything in an image. So this will of like to really absorb as much information as possible. And again, if this comes into maybe a questionable research situation, so it could be used for the good, obviously, but then again, where do the algorithms, the models end up that you develop, maybe with a different intention, but just that would be interesting, I guess.
Yeah, I think like a good example is like what we call image segmentation. So basically, instead of just saying there's an object in the image somewhere, it's really saying like, where's the outline? And there you could think of like, I think the most common applications are like really medical imaging, where you say like, oh, can I find a nodule? Can I find tumor tissue inside of an image? And basically the same algorithm, or like it's the same model, is used for also detecting pedestrians in a street scenery. And of course you have to change the data that you feed into the algorithm, but the algorithm stays the same. So basically there is this interesting detachment between the data that goes into the algorithm and the algorithm itself. But like, yeah, that's basically what I would call kind of multi-purpose. So if it can be used for detection, then it really depends on what you put into it, like what kind of data are you using. And the second thing, what I was referring to, also like these kind of questionable things, and also I think what Simone already said is like, we have this idea how vision works, but this is not what the algorithm necessarily has to do. Like I think a really good example is when you have big data sets and there are things related to winter sports. It's a pretty silly example, but I think it shows really well what is wrong with these algorithms is, let's say you want to classify skiing and that's the only thing that has to do with winter in your whole data set. It will not learn what a ski looks like. It will just learn that the image is white. that there is snow, because probably a lot of other classes are not related to snow. Like a lot of the other tasks in the data set are not related to snow. So like there are these things that I think people start now to call shortcuts that are very dangerous because you can't control for them, because the model will use whatever it can use to make its life as easy as possible.
So it would be a bit like a Pandora's box once it's open, once it's open to the public, because it's scientific research, other people could just download the algorithm or the model and fill it with data according to their ends, right?
Or, sorry to interrupt you, even worse, not even fill it with data, but just use it in another context and say, oh, it's a related context, that will be fine. You just don't know if it will be fine, and there's also like no way to tell until it goes horribly wrong.
Yeah, maybe also this or like another point of discussion that we had during our first meeting was this very important question then, who's responsible, who feels accountable, and where does the bias sit? Because like if the one fraction says, but it's in the data, it's in the images, it's in the politics of the images, but the others say, but it's already the infrastructure, the model. So how do you, like, what do you make out as the current tendencies between this tension?
On my side of the field, everybody tries to avoid this discussion. Like, if you don't have to talk about the data or like where the data comes from, then you won't do that. So you say, oh, I developed an algorithm that works. I showed in my research that it works. It's nice. I have something novel. But please don't ask me about these questions of like, where does my data come from? What else? Maybe what could my algorithm do? Where could my algorithm be used? Where it does harm to people? Like all of this is not addressed at all.
So maybe to also both of you, criticism on AI is then mainly coming from a very different bubble, right? I mean, it's not, or do you see any initiatives that it's being generated from within the scientific community that works and builds with these models? I mean, just if you know, because I would be interested.
I mean, I don't know. I would be happy to hear from Max, I think, on that. Because I mean, in general, that's sort of part of what I'm trying to achieve, at least. And it always feels like sort of an outsider trying to yell, even though, at least from my perspective, what I want to do is not necessarily criticize. I think that's sort of the default that happens, that you sort of take something, you try to analyze it. In my case, this is data sets and trying to figure out where the data comes from, who created it and what it's used for. And also really show that there is such a thing as a data set and make that content visible, because I think that's something that at least we're now on this panel take for granted, but it's still, I think whenever the word algorithm is used, it's a little bit of a uncertain term to a wide audience still. So I think for me, it's more like, rather than operating in different bubbles, it will be interesting to, generate and work on this sort of questions of AI, ML, I think in a much more interdisciplinary manner. So it doesn't end up being someone is creating something and then someone else is critiquing it, but that it's much more a form of creation that includes different pedagogies. So, philosophy, whatever, sort of, I think, create a space to ask bigger questions at the moment of creation rather than whenever something is done. And I think what Max sort of put so aptly, when something goes wrong, right? Because I'm also always interested in, but like, what does it mean that something goes wrong? I think whenever, like when we say this right now in this moment, is sort of, I think all of us sort of have an image in mind of what that might mean, right? Sort of a facial recognition that only recognizes certain skin colors, things like that. But like, is that really something that goes wrong? Certainly we can agree, but I think there's so many other levels of algorithms going wrong or misperforming, performing in ways that maybe they weren't designed for, performing in ways that they do harm, but maybe in a much softer and a much more subtle way. And I think only sort of identifying moments of critique once that has happened, to me at least, doesn't really seem a productive way to go forward, if the word productive even makes sense here. And it would be so much more for one, exciting, I think, purely because all of this technology is incredibly exciting. Like I couldn't sit here and sort of say I'm not like really into it, right? It's like, that's why I'm also working on it. So you're not sort of just someone that's sort of like, man, all of this new stuff sucks. Not at all. It's sort of the opposite, right? It's coming from a place of passion. Because of that, sort of driving it forward in a different way, I think is incredibly exciting. But I mean, yeah, sort of giving it to Max, I'm curious if you know of examples of maybe interdisciplinarity or these questions being asked at a different moment of creation within the scientific field specifically.
Yeah, so there is a community that addresses all of these questions. They have their own conference, and usually it's called FACT. So it's fairness, accountability, confidentiality, and transparency in AI. What I find really sad about that trend that I see now happening is that people working in this very, very important part of AI get pushed into their own bubble. So basically people, not like me, but basically people that do work like me try to also, I feel like, push it away from themselves and say like, there are other people and they take care of that. So I don't have to take care of that. So yeah, I think that's a very concerning trend that I see. And also as a side fact, I see that a lot of people working in the fact communities are actually women, or let's say not men, whereas like the AI, like people that develop these algorithms, like the AI algorithms are mainly men. So I think there's also a very weird division of the field happening.
Yeah, it's a bit of the classic gender division between the humanities and the so-called hard sciences. But Simone, I would like to get back to some visual aesthetics strategies and maybe talk a bit about your work, because I guess for our audience, I mean, it's always good to have an example to make it a bit more tangible what we talk about. I mean, this is also a big, let's be honest, a big problem in how to make criticism understandable, approachable for people who have not been dealing with these topics like maybe us for a couple of years now. So you did a recent work that's called Homeschool, and maybe you want to briefly outline what you did there, because I think it's a very beautiful example of how to make certain things uncanny, that are actually uncanny in itself, but the way you do it, you really make this visible. And I think that's a very important contribution to AI criticism.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Homeschool, most of my work is film and writing, and Homeschool is a 3D animation that uses a synthetic, so in this case, a 3D model. So there are literally 3 models in this data set of items that you would have in a home. I think that already contains a question: what is a home and what are items in a home? And floor plans. And the reason for this data set is that you could train sort of future domestic robots how to navigate a home or how to operate within it. So how to recognize an object that they're supposed to interact with, or how to, clean, and while cleaning know that, I mean, this would already be super complicated, but like how to clean up, right? Like this is trash, or this is something to keep, things like this. And with Homeschool itself, so the film itself is really sort of built these virtual scenographies in Blender 3D software, and then move through it with a voiceover from a first-person perspective, and it's sort of unclear who that is from the height of the perspective. It could be a child, but it could be a robot-ish kind of thing. And it's sort of trying to understand and learn about its environment. And I mean, the film is also sort of, besides actually using the data set, which normally isn't used for this sort of purpose, sort of really put front and center. I was really inspired by sort of a few bits and pieces that I realized while reading the research papers of this data set called CNET RGBD. And it was normally moments when the researchers were sort of annoyed, like, hey, it didn't perform correctly. And one was, for example, that they were generating these rooms, so these indoor scenes, and a lot of the objects that were placed in these indoor scenes were mailboxes. And they were really sort of upset, like, hey, this isn't realistic, right? No one has mailboxes indoors. Sort of going down the stack of what they were doing, they realized, well, basically, it was a really analog mistake, where like mailboxes were deemed boxes put in the folder box. while writing the generative algorithm to create these rooms, it was sort of logical to think, yeah, sure, in sort of indoor spaces, you can have a box, like a box to collect things. And so what happened, of course, is that then these objects then were also placed indoors, so these mailboxes. So it's something that seems sort of already the term realistic, right? Like, hey, this isn't how we live. We don't have mailboxes inside. And how that actually then is reflected in an algorithm, which was a really simple, I think, realization of like, yeah, sure, boxes inside, let's just place them there. But the image it generates is completely absurd and beautiful. But I think it really shows the mechanisms of how these sort of rooms are being built and how simple it actually is. You can really put it in words, right? It's technical, but it's also something that you can sort of spell out in language. And another one was sort of talking to one of the researchers on the team. He was like, yeah, we sort of overtrained the algorithms on toilets because we had way too many files on toilets. And suddenly all our algorithm saw is toilets. So like, the whole world of this algorithm was a toilet. If it was looking at an apple for human eyes, or if it was looking at a bed, it didn't really matter. It was just a sort of a whole world of toilets. And I think that was another sort of beautiful moment where it's just because there was an overload of one kind of data, which as humans we call toilet, right? Sort of the output again was also sort of based on language in that way, because it was just calling it toilet. If it would have been called something else like white sitting object, then that's what it would have been. So for me, again, it was also wondering about this question of language and wondering about like, when is something a toilet and when is it a chair, which I think also culturally is already an interesting question. Like, do we sit on chairs or do we sit on floors and pillows? Yeah. So just, I think to sort of give a short insight, that's a little bit where homeschool comes from. And yeah, what it ended up being, I think sort of not a philosophical piece. It is a child walking through, but the analogy between a child trying to understand its space and computer vision in one way, I think, was a useful metaphor, even though I think in the scientific field, it's not at all. Like, trying to make it a human language, what's going on in an AI is also can be troubling for its own purposes, but for the purpose of trying to communicate how these technologies work to a broader audience, that was sort of the strategy I used there.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. I think this is a very striking example. Max, do you want to add anything to
yes,
that? I guess so.
No, it's so perfect because like what Simone touched on, like why do we call that a toilet and who decided that this image or this object is a toilet? And I think that brings us to an interesting question: who right now is annotating, like labeling these large data sets? And this is mainly done with Amazon Turk, like a website, a web service from Amazon, where you can say, I have these categories, I have these images, and I need somebody to look at these images and press one of the categories. And there's some research about from a nice, very great researcher, Shakir Mohammed and colleagues. They looked into how these things are even related to decolonization, or like basically
yes.
How you can basically trace back who is labeling our data, like who's labeling the data for the West.
Yeah.
And I think that's very, very interesting. And also then you, first of all, of course, you don't know who's doing that, right? You go to a service, you say, I need this much labels for this much data points. And then you get it back after a week and you pay some money. But also I think this is a very questionable procedure, because there are information, or like more and more information get available. Who are these people? Where are they located? And maybe that also is in some cases exploitation. And so I think this is another dimension of where our data sets come from.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only underline that heavily, because this is part of my PhD research, where I look at invisibilized labor behind AI, and it's it's really striking how much of this tedious labeling work. Sometimes it takes up to 7 hours to annotate an image correctly, for instance, for autonomous driving, because you have to annotate really everything. Very precise work needs to be done, and this is being outsourced to Global South, more specifically African workers, who of course work for a fraction of the money, who are very happy that they actually have a job, because the economy is in these territories where the outsourcing companies go even lower. And it's a very like a like a new, gig economy, micro work in this image labeling industries. And I'm really happy that you're mentioning this, because this is another layer of how we could think of politicizing image and training data set, not only what is in the training set itself. For instance, this ImageNet, one of the most famous face recognition data set that has been recently investigated. Maybe you heard about this by Trevor Palin and Kate Crawford, who go down step by step the classification biases, and apparently a young woman in a bikini then becomes a slutty woman, a young man drinking beer becomes all of a sudden an alcoholic. So you have this is the way these images are annotated. And this is this one aspect. I think we beautifully covered this today. And the other one that's a bit also dives into the economy panel, maybe the interlinking between technology and economy, that you really have to understand how many millions of images you need to assemble data. And this work of structuring unstructured data cannot be done by an AI. It has to be done by people. Sorry for my strong comment, but I think I'm super happy that you brought this up.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the same time, I was also really struck by the CNET data set, because it's 3D data. And I mean, on the one hand, I'm just simply, again, from an artistic standpoint, I'm fascinated by 3D software and the history of it, sort of the Western paradigms of perspective, for example, that are embedded within 3D software. But at the same time, I was like, why is this suddenly used for computer vision? Because it's already hard enough to find an ample amount of 2D images. So trying to find enough sort of 3D data seems even harder. And it sort of goes back to what Max was saying, and you too now, which is, right, like you can, you don't bypass, but you have a different labeling process, because you don't actually label the final images, but you label the objects, and then you generate images from that. So you, so how you would sort of imagine it is that you then place these objects in a scene. You sort of automatically have a virtual camera going through these scenes, creating a movie. A movie essentially is a bunch of frames, a bunch of still images. And those still images ultimately become the data set. It isn't the 3D objects or the videos that are generated, but those frames don't have to be labeled anymore, because the 3D data was already labeled. And so, quote unquote, it's already known what's in the image. And so even though right, labeling sort of generates this huge economy, even that already is in a danger of precarity, because it's sped up through yet another sort of way of creating this data. So it's already hugely problematic on its own. And now, yet again, I think it's made more productive and more effective by using a different kind of data. So also there, I think we just always end up in so many stacks, right? That's so difficult to sort of dig through. And sort of find the human within it, because as you say, there always is a human element in terms of creating and making and doing the labor, but also in terms of how it's applied and who is actually developing these technologies.
I think Simone and Max, that was a very nice concluding. I just look at our time. I think we are about to, oh no, Bama says you can go on, perfect. So we don't conclude, no. Absolutely. So we have like these stacks of information or data sets on data sets. And also, as we've talked about in our first meeting, these data sets, they mutate, they morph into new data sets, they travel themselves. So tracking down this evolution is a very valuable and important work. Because, I mean, it's obviously per definitionem, often when it's in corporate context or in state security context, very difficult, very intransparent. But I think it's super important not to lose track of that, so we don't fall into this idea of maybe a Nick Bostrom kind of panoptic gaze, where we just have one eye that sees all. It's a bit of a sinister surveillance idea, but really to understand the complexities and the entanglements, and also the downfalls, the limits, and to really criticize this in a very specific way. And I think that's very valuable research. I can just add to that. Anything? I'm just thinking, because
no, I mean, I think to sort of take it from what you're saying, I think on the one hand, it's data sets that are recycled, and on the other, it's simply also just data, where I think it's not necessarily the whole cluster that has been assembled that could be used for a different purpose. And I mean, I'm just speaking about, for example, again, sort of this data set of body measurements that I briefly spoke about in our last conversation, which was created around the year 2000, simply to be able to create masks and cockpit designs for fighter jets. And because of that, like 4,500 people were 3D scanned. And to this day, it's still sort of the largest amount of 3D scanned human bodies that there are, and it's called Caesar. And so there, I think it's not even just a whole data set that is repurposed for different bits and pieces, but it's, for example, a bunch of these sort of human scans that are used together with other kinds of 3D data, for example, that then is training. I mean, one that I found, for example, is like an image segmentation training data set, which has absolutely nothing to do, of course, with sort of ergonomically designing fighter jets. And I mean, there I've realized that sort of having a visual training background is super useful, because how I do this research is literally going through research papers and looking for what kind of data sets are being used. And normally it's not sort of the file name, because the file name changes. So there isn't really a sort of simple Command F sort of search find way of trying to identify the data and how it's been used over and over. I think Lena is a really good example here, sort of the image of a woman called Lena, who was a Playboy centerfold, one of the first images that was scanned and sort of recycled through the ages as an image to train face recognition or any kind of image compression, image analysis, image segmentation. And the same is happening over, I think Lena we know, and there's so many other ones. And so sort of with Caesar, I was trying to figure out, where does this sort of piece of data end up? And as you do this research, you find so many other ones, and they have their own sort of narratives that are fascinating by themselves. Some of them are really funny, but yeah, it's still, I think what's important to keep in mind is that all of this data has an effect and a consequence in the real world, and that's, so laying it bare and communicating about it is I think incredibly important. But at the same time, I think it's probably also sort of trying to go and look for the interdisciplinary work that also Max was speaking about at the beginning. Yeah, absolutely. Max, do you have any concluding words? If not, we can continue in the Q&A session that we could also open now.
Yeah, maybe the last concluding word. What we didn't touch upon too much right now, but I just want to get off my chest, is like what I see is also the influence of the companies, right? Like now that we talk about data sets, I think, and like data sets and research directions, like computer vision as a whole research direction, I think it's interesting to see how it's driven by the big companies, right? Because maybe as a silly example, like I can't see the German government using a lot of very fancy tools in the next years, but I can see a lot of big tech companies using them right now. So I think there's this whole idea of what kind of research questions do we work in, like especially myself, what kind of research questions do I get, where's the field heading, and who is kind of giving us the data and telling us, oh, look, this is an interesting data set, that's an interesting research idea. And I feel right now this is mainly driven by big tech companies, and then they also benefit mainly from that. So maybe that's...
Thank you so much, Max. Yes, absolutely. This interlocking between industry and objective, independent scientific research is definitely a very important topic. Maybe if there's a question popping up now from Barbara from the Telegram chat, she already said, okay, we will see. But thank you so much for bringing this back to the screen, to the conversation. Very important. But I would give the word to Barbara, I think.
Yes, well,
finally.
No, not finally. That was a super interesting and lively discussion to follow. Thank you so much, Max, Simone, and Ariana. And I mean, it sparked quite some remarks also on Telegram. And we have Mace, who is live jamming with synthesizers and audio effect processors to our voices, apparently, or the soundtrack of this Driving the Human conference. And also the algorithm overtrained with toilets really inspired the collective imagination. So thanks for that. There are like 3 to 4 questions that I would like to bring into the round. The first one has kind of to do with what you were just closing with, Max, with like the empowered use of AI. And it was a question maybe for both of you. Do we need to consider big data skills as crucial civic skills for the digital citizen? Or is it just not possible for the wider public or even non-tech researchers to really engage with this kind of technology? Is it too difficult?
I would have an answer.
Yeah, nice.
But I also personally really want to hear Max's take. But no, I mean, I think mine is more, I think it's a question of accountability, of what we really briefly spoke about, where I'm sort of thinking, you know, just because as a human being, you produce data, if that is on social media or because you're taking a tram or whatever you sort of, however you move through the world, I don't think because you generate the data, you also have to be accountable for it and the way it's being used. So I think having a certain understanding of big data would be fantastic, but at the same time, I don't think that would equal or solve questions around how data is being used. I think those are two very different things. Similarly to discussions of like, you know, do you have to learn how to program? I mean, it's like, yeah, that's fantastic, but that doesn't necessarily make you legible in how sort of a digital world works. And I also don't think it has to. While I'm sort of receding into the dark, I see. It makes it like a doom scenario. No, but it's more, I think it doesn't shift accountability. So I think the question of accountability remains.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with everything Simone said. And then because of that, I maybe throw in another angle on this question, or like another point of view. All of these things we develop are like open source, like mainly, especially when I'm working on a public university. So all of this is open source, and there's a lot of open source tools. And it's very interesting to see how also there the balance shifts a bit, because I will hopefully put it later in the Telegram chat. There are two really cool examples. Like in the US, recently people used facial recognition software and developed an app that detects police officers. So really just turning it around. Like, I don't want to comment on the morality of all of this, but basically it's possible. Like, people can take these algorithms and basically use them also against the government, let's say it like that. And the other example is there's this whole idea of open source intelligence, which I think Bellingcat is for me one of the leading, shall I say companies? I'm not sure. But leading players, and they use a lot of tools where they use data sets and also computer vision algorithms to basically do investigative journalism. So there are positive examples of using all the knowledge that you can find on the internet and use it basically for something that I would call good.
I could also give another example, but we can go to the next one.
Oh, you can, please.
Because, yeah, we have our research fellow, Adam Harvey. Maybe you've heard about him. I really like his work called Megapixels, because there he really does this work of tracking down how, first of all, data sets are being assembled, how are the images gathered. And he found out that in order to have better face recognition, you need so-called data in the wild. That means my face is this way, so all kinds of, or even video, yeah? So you don't pose in front of a passport, immigration border agent, and you look into the camera and it scans your face, but really like natural wild faces. And the way he showed that very big image training data set that are being used not only by IBM or Microsoft on the private side, but as well by Stanford or Duke University, had been assembled through gathering, scraping not only tons of available social media profiles, but as well of surveillance footage camera from a cafe at a corner. So really laying these questionable, more than gray areas open, and it really did a lot of, it gave a lot of repercussions. So as a consequence, the companies, but as well as Stanford and Duke universities, were forced to take down these data sets, and it created a big public critical awareness. And I think projects like this, just as your work, Simone, in a different way, once we start to talk about this and really create critical awareness, it can force, because we know the power of the media, yeah, if we can really start a conversation. And of course, it does not change the power structure from one second to the other, but I do believe these projects are very, very valuable, and that there's many more now being developed. Also about the notion about questionable research. How should state institutions be able to cooperate with private corporations? How could private corporations fund state research like public universities? All these things are very, very important structural topics that we have to discuss much more.
Yeah, I think that kind of already tied to just a second debate that I wanted to take in from Telegram, where Teresa asked, why are we okay with the way how AI is being used? And then Celia responded, maybe technological unconsciousness. And what I liked about all of your answers were that maybe we don't need to really know how to program or really understand all the detail, but we have to be aware of that. And I think all of your work is kind of, and is especially the artistic examples that you mentioned, they are promoting a broader awareness about the problems. And I think that's a good thing to start with. I will put another answer into this round, and I think this has to be my last one because time is running and there are so many interesting points to talk to you with. So it's a question that says, AI is obviously learning from us. Do you think there will come a point where we will learn from AI, but in a really meaningful way, not a dystopian way? What might that look like? Yeah, go ahead.
I would have an example. There's this chess grandmaster, I hope I get the name right, Magnus Carlsen. Mm-hmm. And recently, or let's start in the 80s, there were always chess computers and they play basically using rule books. So it's a very big decision algorithm. It's like, oh, if the person does this step, then I do this step. So it's very easy also to understand how it works. But recently people, I think at Google, developed a new chess algorithm that works more along these lines of using data and using games that were played and analyzing them, and in the end you don't know what the algorithm does anymore. And this algorithm plays in a very weird way. And so this chess grandmaster Magnus Carlsen started to train with this algorithm. And his next tournament he just beat everybody. Because apparently the algorithm found ways to play such an old game in such a new way that people were very not prepared for that. So that would be the only example I could think of top of my head where this is already taking place.
I mean, I think from my own perspective, I mean, I'm already learning from computer vision, at least, not AI. I think that's also a distinction that we haven't made. But in this case, computer vision. I mean, already the toilet example, I think it's telling me so much about assumptions and human assumptions that we're making in sort of training or outsourcing vision. And I think that's super useful for me. It's a check as well of my own assumptions of how the work should operate or what the world should look like. And so I think in that sense, there is already a lot of useful reflection that can happen within the research of AI or computer vision. I don't think we need to end up in yet another sphere. I think it's already telling us, so to speak, a lot.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for your answers. And unfortunately, I will have to wrap this up, but there are so many more answers on Telegram. And I know that at least Max, you will be joining the Telegram chat, right? To catch up on everything that we couldn't finish discussing, right? And I will kind of put my notes in the Telegram chat as well, because that was so interesting with you guys. Ariana, do you want to wrap this up with one sentence? And before I give it to
okay. If I conclude as a media scholar, maybe we can say, wow, okay, let me think. Maybe to say it's just recently I came across a paper from Simon Schaffer. He's a great historian of science and technology. So, and he says technology is default, and fault is already inside that default. So we have all these default normalized notions. But of course, as we talked about, we see the fault level, the limits in it on every level. Maybe that's at least a partial conclusion.
Thank you. That's a really poetic way to end this. So thank you so much, Ariana, Simone, and Max. See you on Telegram. And
Yes.
for everybody else, we are now going to move on in the truest sense of the word, taking all the insights and inspirations from this panel discussion to our next section about knowledge. We will now have a performance by Vivien Tauchmann, who is inviting all of us to follow her movements and join her in another Self is Other training. So see you right after that. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask you to please stand up wherever you are at the moment. For the next couple of minutes, I want you to move your body by following my movements and the instructions.
Stand straight, bend knees slightly, raise right toes, move back to the ground. Raise right toes, move back to the ground. Raise right toes, move back to the ground. Repeat continuously. Bend spine slightly. Bend arms to the front. Lift elbows slightly. Keep hands flat towards front. Move hands parallel forward. Move hands parallel backward. Move hands parallel forward. Move hands parallel backward. Move hands parallel forward. Move hands parallel backward. Repeat continuously.
Try to keep the same speed. Try to keep on going. Try to keep on going. Try to keep on going. Slowly stop your movements and return to your screen.